what we're doing in this season is we're going through the book of Daniel, and we're using John Lennox's book, Against the Flow, which is a book on the entire biblical book of Daniel, very appropriate for today's environment. Daniel was in Babylon in a culture hostile to his faith. How did he deal with it? There's so many great lessons in there. We're going to take a little bit of a detour and hover on one topic tonight. We're not going to look at Daniel in any great depth, except to go back to what we talked about in Daniel 9, the most talked about chapter in Daniel, and maybe the most talked about chapter in the entire Old Testament with regard to prophecy. Remember, we talked about Daniel 9 and these 4 verses. Here in chapter 9, verse 25, it says, "So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem," and that turns out it looks like to be about 444 or 445 BC, "until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be built again with a plaza and a moat," meaning the temple or the city, "even in times of distress." So he's giving some time frame here to when the Messiah is going to come and when the temple is going to be destroyed. We did all the math last time, and I'll just mention to you what the math is here in just a minute, because the next verse says this: "Then after the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing." Last time we pointed out that when you add up all these sevens, which turns out to be years, 490 years, when you do all the math and you convert into Jewish lunar years, which were 360 days, literally the prophecy comes out that Jesus, or the Messiah, is going to die in 33 AD, about the time of Passover. So it's a very specific prophecy. And then it goes on to say, "And the people of the prince," or the ruler, "who is to come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood, even to the end. There will be war, desolations are determined." Now, after that, those are the first 69 sevens. Then there's a 70th seven, and we're not going to get into that tonight. We talked about it a little bit last time. We summarized last time by saying that these verses, the verses 24 to 26, basically says the Messiah will come and make atonement before the second temple is destroyed. That's a summary statement of what we just said there, what Daniel says in those verses, okay? That the Messiah is going to come, and he's going to come and make atonement before the second temple is destroyed. So here's our questions for tonight. Where was Solomon's temple, which was destroyed in 586 BC, and where was Herod's temple, which was destroyed in 70 AD? Daniel was predicting the destruction of Herod's temple. Is there a connection between Solomon's temple and Herod's temple? If you read the book of Ezra, it seems like they rebuilt Herod's temple over the same foundation as Solomon's temple, although Solomon's temple, or I should say Herod's temple, was bigger than Solomon's temple. That's what it seems to be, but let's take a look at the evidence. Now, where do most people think the temple was?
The Dome of the Rock.
Yeah, most people think the temple was right where the Dome of the Rock currently sits. What's the Dome of the Rock? There's a rock underneath this dome, and that rock is considered to be the rock where Abraham sacrificed, or was about to sacrifice, Isaac. Of course, the Muslims change it. It's not Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac, it's Abraham about to sacrifice Ishmael, because Ishmael is really the father of the Arabians. In any event, that's where they think the temple stood, which creates trouble, as you know, okay? Because you see the Jews lined up here on the western wall. This is called the Wailing Wall. This is supposed to be the retaining wall of the temple. And as you can see, this must have been some sort of festival going on. There's a lot of people there at the Wailing Wall. Now, when you go to Jerusalem today, if you want to go on the Temple Mount, it's controlled by the Muslims. You can only go certain times, very specific times. And as you can see, to get in the Temple Mount, these are all security gates. It's like going through the airport. You got to go through metal detectors and all this. And you can go to the Wailing Wall. You can even go underneath. There's a building connected here. You can go underneath, and there's more wall underneath this or inside this building. And if you want to go to the Temple Mount, you go up this bridge and you go up here, and then you can walk around the Temple Mount. You can even walk around the Dome of the Rock if you want. You can do all that, which we did when we were there. But here's some things you ought to know about this. First of all, the temple and the Temple Mount was initiated by King Herod. And he initiated the building of the temple, we think, in 19 BC. He died in 4 BC. That'll have significance later. Just hold on to that fact. The temple was still being constructed during Jesus' day. If you look at John 2:20, you'll see why. And it actually probably wasn't completed until the 60s AD, completely. About 66 AD, which is only 4 years before it was ultimately destroyed. So this was a monumental project. And the main source we have for what this thing looked like and where it was is Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD. And he was in Jerusalem during these times, or during much of this time. In fact, he was one of the rebels that rebelled against the Romans in 66 AD, but he was surrounded, as many of his countrymen were, and instead of committing suicide like his other countrymen did, he actually gave himself up and he won favor with the Roman ruler and became the greatest Jewish historian of the time. Okay? Also, Jesus predicted the complete destruction of the temple by 70 AD. When did he do that? He's in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24. He's up on the Mount of Olives, which I'll show you here in a minute. And he's looking down at the temple, and he basically says that not one stone will be left upon another. And they say, when are these things going to happen? And he says, before this generation passes away, this will occur. He said that in about 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. It happened in 70 AD, but you know, nobody in the New Testament ever goes back and says, look, Jesus was right about this. Why do you think no one ever says that? Because most, if not all, the New Testament was written prior to 70 AD. So they didn't know Jesus was right because it hadn't happened yet. Josephus confirmed that the temple was completely destroyed. Not one stone will be left upon another. In fact, Josephus says if you didn't know the temple was there, you couldn't find it again. It was wiped out completely. Now, the temple was supposed to sit on this mount here, so this Wailing Wall is not really the temple. It's supposed to be the retaining wall to the mount upon which the temple sat. Now, the site was not rebuilt until the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock in 691 AD. And the thought is that they built it there because the Jews thought that's where the temple was, and so we're going to put our edifice there, and we're just going to be much bigger than anything you ever had, even though the temple, I don't know how big the Dome of the Rock is, I'd have to look that up. The temple was quite a sight, according to Josephus in its day. Now, in 1099, the Crusaders came into Jerusalem, overtook the area from the Muslims, and turned it into a church, put a cross on it. About in the next century, the Muslims reconquered Jerusalem and turned it back into the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim shrine. Okay? So the first crusade was ordered in 1095 AD. Don't let anyone ever tell you that that Christianity spread by use of the Crusades. Nonsense. Christianity had been in place for over 1,000 years before there were any Crusades. The Crusades were a military response to Muslim aggression in the Holy Land. That's what they were. Since the Pope and the state were intertwined at that point, the Pope finally said, look, man, we got to take our land back. These Muslims have been overrunning us for 400 years. It's time we had a military response. Now, there were many atrocities committed on the Crusades, but really it was a military response to previous military aggression. Now, due to the Muslim control of the Temple Mount, there's been very little archaeology done on the Temple Mount. You just can't go on the Temple Mount and start digging. They're not going to allow it. Although there have been some archaeological discoveries around the Temple Mount that seem to indicate that the temple was somewhere near the Temple Mount, if not on it, probably on it. We'll maybe get into that a little bit later. But let's back up now and look at this entire area. Here, as you can see, is the Temple Mount. This is about 37 acres. You could put the Rose Bowl on this thing and still have 30% room for parking. 35% room for parking. This is about 36, 37 acres. Here's the Western Wall, right? This is where the Jews pray. Excavations are now being done in this parking lot. Some think maybe the temple was down in this area. In fact, there's about five different theories on where the temple is. The dominant one is it's here. Some say it's a little north. Some say it's a little south. Some say it's here. Some say it's maybe down in the city of David. That's where the temple was. This, as you can see here, is the city of David. This was Jerusalem when David was the king of Jerusalem in about 1000 BC. Right here. This was all of Jerusalem. This didn't exist. This was a hill called Mount Moriah. So this is the area that David ruled over. I mean, it existed, but there was nothing there. It was a field, we think. This is called the Mount of Olives. And you see all the white there? That's because those are all graves. These are all tombs. So when Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You're whitewashed sepulchres," what was he referring to? He's referring to all of the tombs right there on the east side of the city. This is the church that is part of the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where Jesus was in agony before he was executed the next day. Garden of Gethsemane right here. Gordon's Calvary, you know, the famous tomb that they say, well, it could have been the tomb of Jesus, is way up here in the north. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over this way. That's where Jesus could have been buried, other than the Gordon's Calvary. And this is Hinnom Valley, also called Gehenna. This is the Valley of Death. This is where this is referred to in the New Testament as hell, Gehenna, because this is where the pagan Jews would sacrifice their babies to the god Molech, the Canaanite god Molech, which is one reason why God decided we need to wipe out the Canaanites. They're actually sacrificing their children to Molech. And if you read Leviticus, you'll see it says to the Jews, don't sacrifice your babies to Molech. So there's a lot going on. Here's the Kidron Valley. This is a current neighborhood, an Arab neighborhood called Silvan, right here on this side. But we're going to look at this David's, the city of David, the citadel of David here in just a minute. Now, I'm going to show you a picture from the temple, from the Mount of Olives looking toward the temple or looking toward the Dome of the Rock. This is what it looks like from being up on the Mount of Olives. And you're looking down toward Old Jerusalem. Beyond that is the current modern city of Jerusalem. Old Jerusalem is very small compared to the whole Jerusalem. Now, what they're saying is, and most people say, that the temple was right about here, so if you were looking about from the same spot, it would look something like this. Now, keep in mind, this is a model. You see a man standing over here? This is the model at the Israeli Museum, or the Israel Museum, which is right across from the Knesset, west of the old city of Jerusalem. And this is supposed to be the temple, and this is primarily the result of reading Josephus, because Josephus described what the temple was like and how big it was and how many colonnades it had and how many pillars it had and this kind of thing and how big all this was and how it had gold on it and all that. So here's Josephus describing the temple. He also described what's called the fortress called Antonia, or the Antonia Fortress, named after Mark Antony, who was a friend of Caesar, the Antonia Fortress, which was supposed to be attached or near the northwest corner of the temple. All right? So just keep that in mind, because this is the traditional view as to where the temple is. Now here's a question for you. What are the political and theological implications if Herod's temple was not exactly on the Dome of the Rock site? What do you think? Why is this the most contested piece of real estate in the world?
The beast is supposed to build his temple on that same land.
What's that?
The beast and his temple that he's supposed to build in that particular area.
The Jewish temple, if depends on what eschatological view you take, what end times view you take, there's supposed to be another temple rebuilt. Where? The same place the old temple was. And if it's at the Dome of the Rock, what does that mean? Oh, there's going to be trouble. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be a big fight. Well, what if it wasn't right there? There's probably going to be a fight anyway, because Muslims have two houses in their world. There's the house of Islam and the house of war. What does that mean? If you're a Muslim, you're in the house of Islam. If you're not a Muslim, you're in the house of war. The entire world will be converted to Islam according to Orthodox Muslims. Again, not all Muslims believe this, but these are the folks that take the Quran and the Hadith very seriously. So no matter where this temple really is, there's always going to be trouble. But let's go back to our question now. Where was Solomon's temple and where was Herod's temple? This man standing with me here is Eli Shukran. Eli Shukran is an Israeli archaeologist for many years, worked with the Israeli Antiquities Authority there. He has excavated most of the city of David. Eli Shukran helped discover the city of David fortress, which we'll look at here in a minute. It's in this area. This is about a 12-acre piece of real estate. That is a peninsula, as you can see, off to the south of the traditional Temple Mount. And Eli has done a lot of work in here. So much so that he found the Jebusite fortress. I'll explain in a minute. This right here is, here's a picture. We're standing outside. Let me go back a second. We're standing on this side. The Arab neighborhood is behind us. We're standing on this side of the city of David looking this way. Okay? And so this actually was an area called Area G, where they discovered some housing. That's what these pillars are, some ancient housing from the first temple period. So we're talking about prior to 586 BC. All right? And there are some slope walls you can see here. By the way, this area was so sloped that you can understand why David saw Bathsheba from his roof. Right? He's maybe up a little higher than everybody else. He's looking down at other dwellings around his home. So he could just look out and say, oh, look at that. That was the internet in 1000 BC, okay? Right there. So again, here is the city of David down here. This is the traditional Temple Mount. He also discovered, Eli Shukran discovered, before I tell you that, I got to tell you about the fortress. Here's how David took the fortress, the Jebusite fortress, in about 1000 BC. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." Why? This was such a great tower. There was no way anyone was going to get in. They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. How did he do it? Does anyone know? Anyone know the story? What did he do?
There was a water source.
There was a water channel.
And it made the city impregnable, and God told David where it was.
And he went under, just like Cyrus did in Babylon. You remember that? He went under the walls through the water source and came up. One of his generals did that and came up, and they took the fortress. So this fortress was recently discovered within the past few years. The citadel, the city of David, and Eli helped discover it. He also helped discover the pool of Siloam. This is a picture here of a group of tourists there at the pool of Siloam. This is just a small section of it. The pool of Siloam was where Jesus said, "Go wash your eyes in the pool of Siloam and you'll be healed." Where's the pool of Siloam? All the way at the bottom of the city of David, down here. So when you go to Jerusalem and you tour the city of David, they'll take you to the pool of Siloam. This was discovered in 2005. They had a sewer crew that was going to put in a new sewer, and Eli knew they were going to do that, and he said, this area could be an area we want to look at. As soon as the backhoe came down, he went, "Stop! We found some steps here. What are these steps?" Turns out to be the pool of Siloam, the long-lost pool of Siloam. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go about 40 feet underneath the city of David near the Gihon Spring. This is the water source that fed the pool of Siloam. This is the water source into which the general climbed to take over the Jebusite fortress. Now, I got to set this up a little bit. In June of 2014, we did a tour through Israel, and my colleague Bob Cornuke, the real Indiana Jones, I'll tell you about him later, had run into Eli Shukran in the sewers of the city of David. And, what are you doing here? They strike up a conversation, and Bob had this theory that maybe the temple was in the city of David rather than up on the Temple Mount, okay? And so he's down there looking for evidence for this, and he runs into Eli Shukran. And so we go back there in June, and Eli takes just a few of us into this area in the city of David. As you're walking along this side of the city of David, I showed you that picture earlier where Eli's in front of that house, that old house. As you're walking along, we're walking along here, and Eli he stops along this walkway, and he pulls out some keys, and he unlocks a gate. And so about 10 of us come through this gate. This is not with our entire party, just a few select folks in our party. And then closes the gate behind him. He walks up to what looks really like the Bat Cave. There's a cave there, but there's a steel door on it. And he takes out his keys again, and he opens up that door. This is in the side of the hill now. Now, this footage has never been seen by anybody else before except maybe my wife, okay, and my sons. I haven't showed this footage to anybody. When you see us go into this cave, it's going to be a little jittery because it's just me holding my iPad as we're going in. And you'll see steel beams. You go, why are there steel beams underneath this place? Because they took so many tons of dirt out of this area that they had to shore the thing up so the whole city above them wouldn't collapse. So this was discovered in about 2010. We're walking in here, and this happens to be June 19th of 2014, okay? So watch what happens. It's a little jittery, but I want to show you how deep we go into it and what we see. Watch what he does at the end, because he takes out another key. And you'll see what happens when we get there. Here we go. This is maybe a little over 2 minutes.
Front Chuck, and then Lewis, if you can go behind Chuck.
Be careful if you're inside. Okay, Chuck.
Okay.
Be careful. Just go that way.
So good. Yeah, just keep shooting. And Sasha? Yeah. I just want this thing shot to pieces. Okay. Just much as you can. Here, Edward, look that way. Then you go in first. You want to go in this one?
Heather.
Yeah.
This an olive press?
Yeah.
Oh, you got that one.
You guys, let's look more.
Yeah, it's easier to see.
Nice. See that?
You don't have the marker pulls.
Right.
There's water dripping.
Your brother did this? What, other construction?
He has in his steel box something known as a stela. What's a stela? Not somebody in a Marlon Brando movie. A stela is a standing stone that the Jews actually sometimes used to mark an encounter with God. And the most famous one of these is Jacob. Do you remember when Jacob has the dream about angels ascending and descending? This is in Genesis chapter 28. And he wakes up from this dream. They're going up and down this ladder, these angels ascending and descending. And he says this, when Jacob woke awake from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel. Now, this is not Bethel here, that we're in the city of David. Bethel was to the north of Jerusalem. But he commemorated his supposed encounter with God by putting a stela in place, a standing stone. Now, you may have heard other kinds of stela. This is one of the most famous stelas in the world. It's called the Merneptah stela. He was a pharaoh. It was found in Egypt, and it dates from 1208 BC. And on this stela, where there's a lot of writing, it says that Israel is laid waste, meaning the pharaoh defeated the Israelites in about 1200 BC, which is telling us what? The Israelites must have been in the land prior to 1200 BC. The Exodus must have already occurred if some pharaoh is saying he defeated them. And according to the biblical dating, the Exodus occurred in the 1400s BC. So this stela here seems to confirm what the Bible says. In fact, it's the earliest evidence of the name Israel. But Hebrew stelas didn't have writing on them, like most of them do. Now, Eli is going to explain what's in this area that we just went into, which nobody's ever seen before except him and a few folks he's brought in there. In fact, he even refers to the Holy of Holies. So check out, there's about 4 rooms in this area, and we're going to see them now. Again, this is not all professionally edited here. This is just kind of raw footage pieced together on my Mac, just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. The question is, what is this place? Here we go.
This is, I think, the holy of this area. Why? Because there's a standing stone. There's a stela that built here, and this is the connection between the people who worship God. The stela connected to the people to God. We can see it. Let's see it here in this room. There's a stela that's built here, and you come and you came to this stela from the east to the west. All the time, from the east to the west. Okay? Even from the east to the west. Okay? Mm-hmm. So we can see the stela here. It's beautiful. The only one that found here. The best. Because that's the wall here. Here. You don't want to do this. You don't want to sacrifice. To take the skin off from the
What is a stela?
Stela, it's what we have here. We have a standing stone. Standing stone. Someone took a stone and put it, and they put a stone around that. And that's just been a story in the Bible. It talks about Jacob. The Bible says he took a stone and put a stone, and then he put a small stone around that, and then he put olive oil on top of that stone. It's called matzevah in Hebrew. but it's mitzvah. In Hebrew, it's like a stela. This is the connection between Jacob and God. This is the relationship between them with the stone. What is the stone? This is the creation of the earth. And that's what we have here.
So as soon as you saw this, you knew what it was?
Yes, when I saw it, I said it's a mitzvah, it's a worship area, and that's it, immediately. Also, what we have here that V, I think this is a stand for walking with animals. And this is the base of that stand. Because it's continue that room, there's maybe something up above, there may be something up above, maybe something down below that area, this place, but the most important place is what we see now here. The stela, the altar, the olive press, this place, this is the most important place in this area that was built here in that point.
And they more to dig that way?
Look, as I told before, the most important place is here. The stela, the altar, all that area. This is the most important place. Even in the temple, when you are in the Temple Mount, and in so-called, you say, someone else built the temple, all that, what is the most important place? Is the olive, the altar, all that places. All around, it's a place of farm, but we are now in the middle of that area, of that temple.
So you see, he's calling this a temple in the city of David. You go, how could this be a temple in the city of David? The temple is supposed to be on the Temple Mount. Hold your horses. Here are some of the pictures. This is a section of the olive press that we saw. This is the blood channel for sacrifices. So blood came into this channel.
Is that the olive press to the left of it?
No, the olive press was further over. This was another hole there. I'm not exactly sure what that hole is for, but that's the Gihon Springs down there, if you keep going. They found these strange markings that you saw briefly in the video on the floor just to the right if you were looking at the Gihon Springs in another section. And what Eli said these were, as you saw, these were where they sacrificed the animals. They put tables into these ridges or grooves in the floor, and then they could sacrifice the animals on these tables. This is the Gihon Springs, or down to the Gihon Springs. In fact, this is what has been found on this site, just to sum it all up. The stela, the olive press, the blood channel, the cutouts in the bedrock for the sacrifice tables, animal bones have been found there, beulah, which are seals found in the area. There's even one figure from Jeremiah whose name is on the beulah, this little seal that they would use to seal certain documents. And there's the only reference outside the Bible for Bethlehem in archaeology is found in this room, I think Eli said, a stela. It's called the Bethlehem stela, or the Bethlehem beulah, I should say, not the stela. And pottery from about 600 BC. So there's a lot in this room, or these series of rooms, that we're trying to figure out, what is this? In fact, Eli actually says that this is a worship site. Check this out.
They use this place as a worship area, and then they still use it till the end of this area. It's like the end of the 8th century, beginning of 7th century BC. And this is the only place that we know in the city of David that we can say here it was some worship with standing stone, with the stela, with place for sacrifice, with all what we have around here. And this is a place for worship, this is a place for praying, this is a place for a sacrifice, and this is a place people connect with the God.
The question is, what worship site is this? Which temple is he referring to? Here's one possibility. When Solomon was made king, this is what happened. So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and all these guys I can't pronounce, went down and put Solomon on King David's mule and escorted him to Gihon. This area. 30 feet away is the Gihon Spring. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon." So it seems that David's tent, that he considered some sort of a tabernacle, was right there next to the Gihon Springs. So, was Solomon's temple built in the same spot as David's tent? That's the question, right? Because Solomon's the son of David. Does he decide he's going to build it in the same spot, right next to the Gihon Springs? Let's take a look at what the Bible says. And you got to do some detective work to figure this out. I don't even know if I have it right here, but let's just take a look. This is 2 Chronicles, I should say. I should say 2 Chronicles. This is 2 Chronicles 3:1. Yes. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So the temple, the Bible says the temple was built, Solomon's temple was built on this guy's threshing floor, Mount Moriah. Now traditionally, where's Mount Moriah? It's up here. Okay? It's up here. What we might call now the Temple Mount. That's Mount Moriah, but is that the threshing floor? Let's look at another piece of scripture and see if we can kind of cross-check this. When the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, David has done something wrong and now the angel may destroy Jerusalem. The Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, "It is enough, now relax your hand." And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So, this was Jerusalem at the time. And it says that the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem. So can he be in Jerusalem? Probably not. He's probably up here, right? Now, maybe he's not all the way up there. Maybe he's not up where the Temple Mount is. Maybe he's in this area between called Ophel. Maybe he's right near there. We don't exactly know. Where do you put threshing floors? What are threshing floors for, by the way? Does anyone know?
Sacrifice area?
Grain.
Well, but that's not really why it's separating. You're separating the grain, right? You're separating the wheat from the chaff. You probably don't put it inside the city walls because you need some wind. Although it would be nice if you could have it in the city walls because it's protected. You probably want to put it up on a hill so you have some wind, although valleys can have wind too. The problem is, if of course you put it up on a hill, then you got to cart all your stuff up there. Right? So it's kind of controversial as to where the threshing floor might be, but it's probably up here. It seems anyway. So again, here's our big picture. Maybe the angel was right here on the edge of the city of David. And so the threshing floor could be here, or it could be here, or it could be up here. Right? I mean, that seems to be the case. So let's take a look now. So is this area under the city of David a small remnant of Solomon's temple, David's tent, or something else? Well, what do you think? Let's have a little sizzle reel here, and then we'll see what the archaeologists say. Here we go. Could history be wrong to say that the Temple Mount is where the temple is? In fact, this is Bob Cornuke's cover of his book called Temple. Could history be so stunningly wrong? Let's see what Eli Shukran actually says about that site that we were in. Does he say it could be Solomon's temple? Here's what he says, because I asked him directly.
Does he say Solomon's temple might be here? But
I'm saying this is a temple from the first temple period, but this is not a temple built by King Solomon. Because we're in the city of David, we're in the citadel of David, and King Solomon built the temple outside of the citadel of David.
So this could be as old as Jebusite and Melchizedek.
I don't know, maybe. maybe that take us that time. Because here, this is the area that built before the time of King David, and they used it in the Jerusalem time, and they used it in the Melchizedek time. I don't know how to connect it, but maybe.
Archaeologists like to say maybe a lot. In fact, that woman who was just asking him the question was Rhonda. She's the gal that organizes all these trips for us. She's the gal whose pastor was just shot. But in any event, so he's saying no, it's not Solomon's temple, because he believes that Solomon's temple was on the Temple Mount. Now, working for the Jewish Antiquities Authority, you better say that. Right? But most archaeologists agree with him. It is on the Temple Mount. Okay? Here's another view. This is my friend Bob Cornuke, who wrote a book on this called Temple. And he can't take a firm view on it either, but he leans the other way. He says this could be a remnant. You'll see what he says here.
The uniqueness of this room is I had done research to try and find the location of Solomon's temple. And I believed it would be right by the Gihon Springs, really close to the Gihon Springs. The Gihon Springs are over there, just a few feet away. And so if this is perchance something to do with Solomon's temple, we have consistent evidence. We have a blood channel here that shows that they did blood sacrifices. They tied up the animals on rings in the walls. You can see that. The oil press over there shows that they made olive oil, and so they would have put, Josephus says they put oil on the high priest, and they anointed him, and the spring water would be there. We have an area over there where they did blood sacrifices. So this is a very interesting room, but we don't know what it is for sure. It's obviously a place of very high importance. Whether it's involved with the temple or not, we don't know. But it has great importance because it is a holy place where they did sacrifices. And they felt that it was certainly holy. We don't know what it is for sure. Ellie has some opinions of it.
Does he say Solomon's temple might be here? But
I'm saying this is a temple from the first temple period, but this is not a temple built by King Solomon.
But me personally, I believe that the evidence here is very compelling that this very well could be from Solomon's temple. It's close to the Gihon Springs, has the animal blood troughs here where they did the sacrifices, the olive oil presses where they tied up the animals, and it's dated to the time of the first temple period. So that being said, it gives your heart a little flutter to think that this actually could be part of Solomon's temple.
Now, what is the truth? I don't know. Because I'm not skilled enough in this area to know. Although I'll give you some resources and you can check it out yourself. In fact, let me say this though. This model and location may not be completely accurate. Why? Well, first of all, check this out.
Ellie, can you say again, you think this wall was built in 20 AD?
Yeah, this wall was built in 20 AD, 20 years after King Herod the Great. Why? Because I found a coin in pottery that dates that to 20 years after the time of King Herod the Great, in the beginning of 1st century AD.
That raises a big question. Here is the question. How could Herod's temple be on a foundation that was built more than 20 years after his death? Well, I did. He didn't really have a good answer, but let me surmise it could be that the temple was built or was in the process of being built, because as we said earlier, it wasn't really completed until about 66 AD. So the temple was being built and the retaining wall around the temple was being built as well at the same time, right? That's possible, certainly possible, but this is interesting because just about every other archaeologist is going to say, well, you know, the temple wall there, the retaining wall, the Temple Mount was built by Herod. Well, Herod had died in 4 BC. And Ellie's finding coins under the lowest level, or the lowest level he could get to, of the western wall, this wall right here. And they're coins that were minted in 17 or 18 AD or 20 AD. So this raises a question, doesn't it? He also found pottery in there from that period. So who knows now? It's certainly possible the temple was being built and then a retaining wall was being built at about the same time, and so that this is not a knockdown, drag out, this temple wasn't there. It could have been there, and in fact the evidence seems to point that way. However, let me go back to this. This model may not be completely accurate. The Fort Antonia here, which is where the Romans were, the Roman soldiers, was higher than the temple. The southeast tower was 100 feet, or a little over 100 feet, and may have housed up to 6,000 soldiers, some of whom came down steps to get Paul in Acts chapter 20. Remember when Paul creates a commotion in the temple, and they want to kill him, they want to drag him out of there, and then the soldiers from Fort Antonia come down and grab him. What's all this commotion about? And he says, look, I'm a Roman citizen. And then he kind of goes up the steps a little bit and he starts talking to the people there. Well, they had to come down into the temple in order to do that. If they're coming down into the temple's not the highest point. The Fortress Antonia is the highest point. And Josephus says it was higher than the temple. It was overlooking the temple. It said that the temple overlooked the city and Antonia overlooked the temple. So this drawing here, or this model here, it is higher than the temple, but we're not exactly sure if this really was how it was, because Josephus gives some conflicting information. The Antonia fortress was probably at the highest point of the Temple Mount over the current Dome of the Rock site, because Josephus says, in fact, let me just read you what he says. He says, now, as to the Tower Antonia, this is in one of his books called Wars. He's talking about the war between the Romans and the Jews. It was situated at the corner of two cloisters of the court of the temple, of that of the west and of the north. So, right here, the west and the north. So they got that right. It was erected upon a rock of 50 cubits in height. Now, 50 cubits, a cubit is about 1.5 feet. So this is, 75 feet or so. So it's on a rock, 75 feet, and was on a great precipice. So it's not on a flat area, it's on a precipice. Maybe flat at the very top, but it's on a precipice, this Fort Antonia. And he says it was the work of King Herod, wherein he demonstrated his natural magnanimity. I mean, Josephus had to talk well about the Romans because he was working for them. But you get the idea. So it appears that it could be the case that the Antonia fortress was actually on the Dome of the Rock, not the temple. Also, Josephus refers to two 600-foot cloisters or hallways, these things, that go between the Antonia fortress and the temple. So perhaps there was more distance between the temple and the fortress than this model suggests. It's possible. I don't know for sure because there's so much information out there, so many different theories out there. All I'm trying to say here is if you really want to get into this, you can. You can read all sorts of different people and opinions and archaeologists on this. But there's not a lot of archaeological evidence because, again, they really can't excavate the Temple Mount. So they can go from what Josephus says. There have been some things found, like there's been an inscription that says to the trumpeting area or to the place of the trumpeting. But that seemed more like a sign, like to Charlotte. It wasn't in Charlotte. It's a sign to Charlotte, right? To the trumpeting area. So where that was found, that doesn't necessarily mean that's where the temple was. It could have been, but maybe not. And then they have found inscriptions that say you can't bring a foreigner in here on the Temple Mount. So that's evidence that the temple was somewhere on the Temple Mount. But where on the Temple Mount is the question. The question is, where is the real temple? Where is the real temple? Hint, it's not in this picture. Where's the real temple? You are the real temple. See, this is just an historically interesting quest we're on. But when Jesus came and sacrificed himself on Mount Moriah for all of us, he made it possible for living temples to exist, and that's us. So while this may be historically interesting, while there may be some kind of memorial temple built in the last days, for Christians, we need to keep in mind the real temple is when you go home and look in the mirror. Christians are the real temple. Now, if you go back in history to Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac, where is he about to do it? On Mount Moriah. Remember, he's about to do it. And as, by the way, as they're heading up there, Isaac, who's probably 13 or 14 at the time, looks over at Abraham as they're carrying all this wood up the hill. Where's the sacrifice, Father? And what does Abraham say? God will provide the sacrifice. Turns out the ram caught in the thicket is the sacrifice. But for a while, Isaac thought it was him. Then, fast forward 2,000 years to the same spot, Mount Moriah, God is the sacrifice. You see, 2,000 years ago, Isaac was a type of Christ. In other words, he typified, he looked forward to what Christ would ultimately do. There was an aspect of Isaac's life that he was almost a sacrifice. God was going to kill a son. But then 2,000 years later on the same spot, God actually does kill a son, his own, for us. So while, again, this is interesting, the real issue is we are now the new temples. If you want to dive into this, here are some books you can get. This guy, Lean Rittmeyer, is probably the top archaeologist when it comes to the Temple Mount. And he will make a strong case that the temple was literally on the Temple Mount. This Rose Guide to the Temple, anything Rose puts out is great. It's a picture book. It's a picture book with a lot of different sort of graphs in it and charts in it and all sorts of stuff that you can, all that kind of stuff. So if you're really into this, I highly recommend this book. This guy here who did this will make the strong case that the temple was on the Temple Mount. Bob's book is Temple, Amazing New Discoveries That Change Everything About the Location of Solomon's Temple. He's trying to make the case that Solomon's Temple was in the city of David. Okay? We report, you decide. You ought to read all this stuff and figure out where you come down. Now, if you're going to put a gun to my head and say, what do you think has more evidence behind it? Just in the little I know, I would probably, despite the fact that Bob's my good friend, I'd probably say these guys probably have more evidence behind them. But again, I'm an amateur at this. I don't know for sure. So you can read the material. And what's that?
Where they think it is if it's not.
Where do they think what is?
So what do they think it is that you were pointing out there?
Oh, what do they think
Does a temple have to be a church by the wayside or a...
That's the question. We don't know what it is. That's why Bob said we don't really know what it is, although it could be a remnant, he thinks, of Solomon's temple.
Oh, we saw underground there. That doesn't look real huge.
It's not very big. It could have been.
How big an area were you in where all that was?
Oh, it was probably half this room, it could have been a house. It could have been a house, and somebody put a stela in a house. But why would they have a blood drain? Unless maybe they're butchers. I mean, who knows? They had the olive. They had those. There's a lot of speculation.
Why not keep digging?
Yeah. Well, here's one thing I didn't say. You can't dig anymore. You're at bedrock. You can't go any deeper there.
But what artifacts did they take out of that room that you were in to indicate what it was or how it was?
Well, they took a lot of dirt out. They did find the Bethlehem Beulah, I think, in that room. They found animal bones in that room. I don't know what else they found, but you see what Ellie is saying is that this is a special place. He's calling it the Holy of Holies. Holy of Holies. Well, he's saying that if you find a stela, that is a Hebrew way of saying this was an encounter with God. and they were making sacrifices there. What is it? Nobody really knows for sure.
So they didn't move stelas, really.
That thing is in some kind of mortar. I don't know how they made that, but yeah, that's solid in there. They put a standing stone and they put small stones around it, cemented it in there. That's why he put a steel box around it. He put a steel box around it to protect it. Notice he had a key.
Ellie did that.
Ellie did that. He's got the key to all this. You can't do this. You just can't go on this tour. Nobody's going to take you in there. You got to know him.
Why would that
Greg?
be below ground like it was? Why would they put the stela? I was just curious.
Well, because a lot of silt has built up since then. Remember, this is 2,600 years ago, right?
No, city above you, so all those steel pillars are holding up.
They're holding a whole bunch of stuff up. Greg?
What would happen to Ellie if he took the stance that Bob posed?
I don't know. He's not employed by the Antiquities Authority anymore. But he is a tour guide over there, and he doesn't. I asked him, I said, do you want to do any more archaeology? He goes, 20 years of digging is enough. So he's moved a lot of dirt.
Was he employed by the Antiquities?
He was. No, not. He had just retired from them at that point.
Do you think his view is influenced?
I don't know. I don't know if it is. I think he's just following what the majority of scholars believe. I mean, there is another view here. This is called Ernest Martin. Ernest Martin was a guy who lived about 20 years ago, and this was his view. He thought that most of the Temple Mount was actually the Fortress Antonia, and that this was the bridge with steps down to the temple. Now, this temple is only 300 feet by 300 feet or whatever, and this is down toward the city of David now. But it doesn't seem like Josephus would agree with this. But Bob thinks this could be it too. But when you read Josephus, you go, Josephus doesn't appear to say this. So it's speculation at this point.
The preceding program was brought to you by CrossExamine.org and NRB TV.
Chances are, someone you love will one day be affected by some kind of vision problem. Save your vision for the years ahead.